So, what's going on with this idea of the infused virtues as opposed to the acquired virtues? Why are we ending our discussion of moral theory here? What's their significance? And I really like the way McCabe describes it in the little summary essay on virtue and truth that I gave you. The infused virtues are God giving us His personality. God giving us the chance to put on Christ, to circle back to these ideas we talked about at the very beginning with morality of happiness. And the idea of the infused virtues, of course, comes from the writings of St. Paul, where he discusses God gives us faith, hope, and love. And what the early Christians, and we saw this even in our readings by Augustine on In De Doctrina earlier, saw is that the idea of faith, hope, and love complements perfectly this concept of the acquired virtues that they were getting from Aristotle and Cicero and the classical tradition. That the infused virtues are about orientation and capacity to be like God. They're the change from the inside that works outward in the same way that the acquired virtues are the bodily habits and actions that work inward. So, when Aristotle talks about the acquired virtues and talks about what type of person can acquire the virtues, which remember is always the free Athenian citizen with education, the reversal that comes from this idea of the infused virtues is that none of this has anything to do with our worldly status. It only is connected to God's grace and God's action in the world. And that by God's action and God's gift, which we cannot deserve, everyone, whoever they are, is given the chance to be part of God's family, to be a citizen in the commonwealth of the church. Augustine says a commonwealth is joined together by what they love, and the core of the infused virtues is love. The love of God that each of us is given, and a love that flows out into our relationships with others. We're given the opportunity to love others with God's love. And this, of course, transforms all of our actions. It changes everything about us. If our motive, the actions may look the same, but if our motivation is no longer the love of the earthly community, the love of ourselves and our satisfaction in our natural ways, but the love of God and the desire for relationship with God, the faith in God's promises, and the hope, the certainty, even though not seen, that God's plans will come true, all of our actions look different. And the capacity to live this way is something we can never achieve by ourselves. We can never achieve, even if we have the right education or the right family or the right skills. It is only a gift from God, and it is utterly transformative. So, I want to highlight a few problems in thinking about the infused virtues that have come up in the history of moral theology. And then we'll spend the class diving more deeply into Westberg's discussion of charity and Aquinas' discussion of the infused virtue of hope. So, one of the problems is what happens with Luther, the Protestant Reformation. Faith subsumes all the other virtues. It's faith. It's the faith that you possess, and Calvin modifies this some, but it's the faith that you as an individual believer possess that makes it possible for you to have a relationship with God. And all the other and this is the big focus rather than the focus that had historically been there on in the virtues, which is love as the pinnacle, a love that is received from God and then flows outwards, rather than a faith that gives us access to God. So we see in the Protestant Reformation both a reversal and a narrowing of the discussion of the infused virtues. So here's the other error that has come up on the Catholic side, and this goes back to our discussion of sort of fundamental option thinking. There can be a tendency to say, well, the infused and the acquired virtues are separate. You receive the infused virtues, and that doesn't really affect how you practice the acquired virtues in the world. It doesn't affect how you live. You just sort of have these feelings of faith, hope, and love. And I think it's probably not just an error that Roman Catholic moral theology can fall into. It's an error that all of us can fall into with this disjunction between, well, this is the stuff on the inside and doesn't actually transform how I live. It's either a rational or an emotive response rather than the actual principles of our actions, what drive our actions. And so you can again get back to this place of saying, well, that person is a good person. They really love Jesus. They have a lot of faith, but it's not really tied to their practices in the world. And or in the kind of some developments of the Calvinist tradition, you can say, well, we can't know about a person's relationship with God. The only thing we can know is we can see if they're being blessed and their endeavors prosper. So we have to assume that they're chosen, they receive these infused virtues because they're rich. This is the kind of development of the Protestant work ethic. But rather, the fullness of this idea of the infused virtues are that the infused virtues and the acquired virtues are intricately connected to the human person. And this is because, along with the infused virtues, we receive a whole new set of cardinal virtues. We receive infused justice, infused prudence, infused fortitude, and infused temperance. And here's the difference. The habits you might develop before you receive the infused virtues, before baptism, they can prepare you to receive these better. If you're a temperate person already, you may have the tendency to be temperate, but you're being temperate in a different way. The infused cardinal virtues mean that all of the actions that you did, all the habits you have are pointed towards God. So here's just kind of an easy example. If you have the acquired virtue of temperance, you're baptized, and that is replaced by the infused virtue of temperance. Your reason for living moderately, for living according to the mean, is going to be different. You're living appropriately to God's glory, not for your own health, just health, or not for weight control or whatever, but you're living for God's glory. Also, the mean moves on these. So, if a person is engaged in spiritual disciplines to grow closer to God, say regular practices of fasting, that's going to look different than somebody who is engaged, that may be closer to the mean than somebody engaging in fasting just for health. If you are fasting with an orientation to God, then how much fasting is appropriate may look different than, I'm fasting for my health, or to lose weight or something like that. The quintessential example of this is, of course, the transformation of fortitude. A soldier who possesses the acquired virtue of fortitude, the paradigmatic example of that is somebody dying for his country. But you're supposed to resist. You're supposed to fight. You're not just supposed to sort of go passively to your death. However, a martyr, a person who possesses the infused cardinal virtue of fortitude, may very appropriately go passively to her death, because the orientation is not, I'm going to save my country, so I need to fight as much as I can and be as, or a resistance, but rather to orient people towards God and to demonstrate what God's love looks like in the world and the witness of the power of that person's faith and the power of the gospel. So a martyr isn't supposed to seek out martyrdom. It also isn't the the infused virtue of fortitude doesn't look like, oh, you have to try to escape, you have to fight, you have to get away. No, you receive what has come to you because you're doing this with an orientation to God, because you're the motivating the principles from which this practice of the cardinal virtue springs is about witnessing to God, not saving your country. So the mean of the virtue moves if you're talking about an infused virtue. Also, this doesn't mean when we receive the infused virtues that we're going to exercise them perfectly. You actually can grow in the infused virtues. You receive this deposit of faith, but the more, this is where, again, moral theology and ascetical theology have to come together. The spiritual practices increase the infused virtues within us. We grow in the patterns of faith and hope and love. And of course, sin can diminish them. We can fall out of charity. We can have a rupture of charity with God. We also can develop, these practices also contribute, of course, to the development of the infused acquired virtues. So like I said, ascetical practices help us develop infused temperance. They help us develop faith, perhaps, closer relationship with God. So this isn't something that you just get. It's not like I think it's exactly right when the Apostle Paul talks about a deposit of the Holy Spirit that's been given to us. And then we think about Jesus in the parable of the talents, that each person is given something that they're called to develop for God's glory. We need to think about the infused virtues in the same way. It's not static. And so this is where the analogy with the acquired virtues is really helpful in, I think, understanding better what Paul and then the rest of the tradition talk about when considering faith, hope, and love. Remember, Paul always says these athletic metaphors that Paul uses capture, again, this sense of spiritual striving. Of course, what is the paradigm for athleticism in the Greek tradition? Of course, being athletic shows that you've developed the virtues, that you have discipline, that you have strength. And it's the spiritual analogy is exactly what the Apostle Paul is getting us to think about when we're talking about the development of the infused virtues. So it's grace. It's all grace. It's grace all the way down. But the gift of grace, going back to our theme of freedom, is setting us free to pursue excellence in God. The grace leads to our formation. We're called to formation. It's not just a passive act of receiving. So look forward to talking more about, a little more specifically about love and hope and the infused virtue generally. And like I said, I commend the McCabe essay to you. It's a quick, easy read. It just provides a really nice overview and summary of everything we've been talking about with the virtues.